Well, welcome everyone to our program for November, a few days before Thanksgiving. For those that don't know me, I'm Dr. Greg DiNicola, the president of the Laguna Beach Historical Society. Scattered around the room are our very hardworking board members, so feel free to afterwards to say hi and thanks to them. A few general announcements. I was asked to let everybody know we're putting a new roof on our bungalow, and if anybody either puts up roofs as a hobby or a living, or knows somebody who puts up roofs, I'll be hanging after the program. Please let me know. If you enjoy coming to these programs, visiting the bungalow, getting the newsletter in the mail, visiting our website, we do need continual funding, so please feel free to go onto the website and make a contribution. There's a little jar as you walk in to say thank you for tonight if you wish. And if you want to become a member, we'd love to have you if you're not already one. Johanna Ellis is toward the back there, and she'd be happy to help you become a member. And if you want to make a donation, you can do that too in the back of the room after the program. So we thank you for that. I did want to mention that tonight's program is about the Thurstons, I guess Joe Thurston's book, The Early Days, but the Thurston family. And we are very pleased and proud to have Thurston descendants among us. In the second row here, we have Gail Keller and her daughter, who are directly descendants of Joe Thurston's sister. Let's give her a hand. So in the true spirit of election year next year, I'll expect some fact-checking on our speaker tonight to see how accurate he is. So as I mentioned, our program is on the Thurston family, or Joe Thurston. I can't really summarize any better than Johanna did in the newsletter the essence of the talk tonight. The Thurston family, as you probably know, for those who are into the history of the town, homesteaded in 1871 on 152 acres in Aliso Creek. Joe was 3 years old at that time, lived here most of his life, passing away in, I think, 57 or mid-50s, at the ripe old age, I think, of 87 or something like that. He was known for selling produce grown on his property, including watermelons and cucumbers and lima beans and potatoes. With his partners, he purchased and developed the land right above us, and he named the area Temple Hills because he was inspired by the area's physical and spiritual beauty. He wrote a book, The Early Days, published in 1947. An interesting book. For those who haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It definitely has his own little twist of his childhood and of the city we all love. To talk about that book and the Thurston family and Joe Thurston in general, I'm pleased to announce our speaker. He and I have a little difference of opinion because those who know from my previous introductions, I tend to give half-hour to 45-minute introductions, and apparently he prefers like a 2-second introduction. So out of respect to our speaker, because I would never want to offend him, I was going to mention that he is an historian, an author, a public speaker, but I won't do that now, that he's a historical society volunteer, like many of us here, a museum curator, an archivist, a teacher, and of course tonight, a public speaker. He has written hundreds of articles, dozens of books on Orange County history, and been writing about the Orange County history now for 40 years. He served as the Orange County archivist for 5 years, from 2003 to 8, and of course has long been very active at the Orange County Historical Society. I do want to end my short introduction with a quote from his own website. He said, "My emphasis has always been on telling the story, and there are a lot of them still to tell." So our story tonight is Joe Thurston. Let's hear what he has to say. Please join me in welcoming Phil Brigandi.
They asked me if I wanted to sit up there. I think people get nervous when you sit down to give a talk. They think you're settling in for the duration. As for the Thurstons, thank you for coming. I don't think you'll hear anything you haven't heard before. I want to be clear, in fact, what I want to talk about tonight. It's about a book, Joe Thurston's Laguna Beach of Early Days, published by him in 1947. So think of this as sort of an extended book report on one of the most unusual books ever written on the history of Orange County. Perhaps it will help to start with what this book is not. It is not a history of Laguna Beach. It is not, especially according to some of Joe's siblings, a history of the Thurston family. It's not even much of an autobiography. What it is, I think, is Joe Thurston's recollections on his early life and some stories he clearly liked to tell. Now let me tell you a little bit about the Thurstons, and much of this you won't learn from Joe's book. George and Sarah Thurston both came from early Mormon families and were pioneers in Utah. In fact, Sarah's father, Erastus Snow, was one of the quorum of 12 apostles of the Mormon Church, second only to President Brigham Young. Depending on which source you believe, he had between 4 and 16 wives and more than 30 children. Sarah was the first. She married George Thurston in 1858, and they had 15 children themselves. George Thurston had been very active in the Mormon Church himself, serving as a local bishop and as a missionary to England. But in 1870, he left both the church and Utah, taking his family to California. They lived for a while in San Diego County, then came here looking for land to homestead. They finally found it in Aliso Canyon and settled there towards the end of 1871. Joe Thurston was about 3 years old. Even by the standards of their day, the Thurstons had a pretty tough life. There wasn't much land, there wasn't much water, and they lived a fairly isolated, self-sufficient life. And eventually, George Thurston abandoned them. We had lots of hard times and lots of good times, Mrs. Thurston told a reporter 35 years later. And in looking back, there are some terrible things I don't like to think about or talk about. Joe Thurston was the oldest, still at home when his father left, and stayed on with his mother and younger siblings for another 7 years. At age 26, he finally left and wandered from job to job for a couple of years before eventually coming back and taking over the ranch, still supporting his mother, who had moved to Santa Ana. Initially, he rented the place from her, and later he bought it. Mrs. Thurston died in 1928. Joe stayed on the ranch, often alone, until 1921. He made his living farming, mostly fruits and vegetables that he sold to the tourists each summer here in Laguna Beach. The old-timers all remembered his watermelons especially. He finally moved to town around 1920 and married a local school teacher, Marie Harding. Thurston Middle School is named for her. Joe turned real estate developer and opened the Temple Hills tract, but the Depression hit him hard and he went bankrupt in 1935. Now, you'll only learn about a third of that from Joe's book, and not in any organized way. But it was also in 1935 that the old South Coast News asked Joe Thurston to write up some of his reminiscences of early Laguna Beach, and he did, every week for a year and a half. 10 years later, Joe celebrated his 75th anniversary of his arrival in Laguna Beach, and he turned to the subject again. And as I said, in 1947, he published Laguna Beach of Early Days. His book is fully rewritten. There's nothing directly quoted from his newspaper articles, though some of the passages follow them pretty closely. He starts by citing the success of his articles, but says he had to leave out many personal details. This created demand for a more complete story, he says. That story is almost Shakespearean or Dickinsonian in its portrayal of his early life, and especially of his father, who is never even named in his book. He is always simply Father. He begins with his father leaving the church. He does not say which one. and bringing the family to California, where he hoped to find government land to homestead. He didn't have much luck, and according to Joe, he began to suspect that the government land office was in cahoots with the big ranch owners to keep out settlers. Even after they'd found the land in Aliso Canyon, Joe records many run-ins with Cyrus Rawson, who owned the Niguel Ranch in those days, though he did like Louis Moulton later. In fact, in 1871, when the Thurstons arrived, neither Rawson nor anyone else knew exactly where the boundaries were of the Niguel. It wasn't officially patented by the government until 2 years later. A year after that, George Thurston finally filed a homestead, getting his patent for 152 acres in 1879. Unfortunately, that 152 acres included steep hillsides, the meandering creek bed, and worthless land near the shore. Still, the Thurstons managed to grow crops, raise chickens and cows for eggs and butter, and keep bees. They also grew grapes and did make a little wine, walnuts, and watermelons, of course. Aliso Creek was too salty to drink, so they hauled their drinking water from a spring nearly 3 miles away in Woods Canyon. They took their baths at the beach, men on one side of the rocks, women on the other. Joe puts much emphasis on all of this as the last of the pioneer days before the machine age began. He says when they arrived, there was no one living on the south coast from Newport Beach to San Juan Capistrano, which might even be true, and that it was 5 days to Los Angeles and back and 7 days to San Diego. The only schooling they got was at home, and their father did all the doctoring for the family, including, he implies, delivering his own children. His mother rarely left the ranch, and the children almost never. They did not celebrate birthdays or holidays, except Christmas, he says, adding that he could only recall ever getting one toy as a gift. According to Joe, he was put to work at the very early age, out herding cattle on foot at age 8. By age 10, he tells us, he came to feel like a slave, ordered around and shown no respect. But then he realized that he could think what he wanted. For the next 25 years, in fact, maybe all of his life, Joe Thurston seems to have lived a great deal inside his own head. We do learn a little bit about early Laguna and some of the other pioneers. Joe says he was about 13 when he started selling watermelons to campers at what was then known as Riverside Camp along Main Beach in the early 1880s. Later in the decade, Southern California's real estate boom brought more settlers to the area, and there was even briefly a store and post office in the boom town of Arch Beach. But almost from the beginning, we read time and time again how awful he thought his father was. On page after page, George Thurston is described as quarrelsome, puritanical, short-tempered, controlling, and violent. "If I can't make my children love me, I'll make them fear me," he claims he once said. It seemed that he took every occasion to humiliate and crush the spirit in us. The last straw, Joe says, came when he was 18. His father was scolding one of his other sons, and his mother stood up for him. He had words with her, then slapped her in the face. Joe says this was the first time he'd ever seen him do that. He stepped in and told him that he'd gone far enough. By standing up to him, he claimed, his authority in his own household, where he had ruled as a dictator and a tyrant, had departed from him, never to be regained. His oldest brother, George Jr., happened to be visiting, and he insisted on going even further. Despite their mother's objections, he and Joe went to Santa Ana, found an attorney, and got her to file for divorce. Almost immediately after, according to Joe, their father packed up and left. From this point, Thurston's book gets a little more disorganized as he drifts back and forth between his life before and after his father left. As I said, as the oldest son still at home, he felt responsible for his mother and took charge of the ranch for about 6 or 7 years. Finally, he announced that he was leaving to make his way in the world. His mother and her younger daughters moved to Santa Ana soon after. Joe came back in 1896 and took over the ranch again. Soon, to hear him tell it, virtually alone. By reading between the lines, though, he seems to have often had hired help. Still, he says he felt very strongly the sense of being alone, which, in a way, pleased him. He says he talked to his horses a lot. In fact, we hear a lot about his horses later in the book. But again, his stories drift as he writes more about the growth of Laguna Beach. He says, by the way, that a banker from Riverside named Dyer built the first cottage here. He writes about the post office, the stagecoach coming from the trains at El Toro until they were replaced by Joe Yock's auto stage, the school and the community's slow transition from summer resort to city. Along the way, he gives Nate Brooks' twin brother Will quite a roasting, is kinder to old Joe Lucas, but not to Frank Hemingway. Late in the book, we hear a little more about his father and a little bit of his background. Joe says that after about 10 years, he made an effort to reestablish relations with his family. But according to Joe, none of them would have it. He was in Texas then, and Joe always assumed he died in the Galveston hurricane of 1900. But there are some indications it may have been a year or two later. Then it's back to the development of Laguna Beach, including the hotel, the art colony, the early newspapers, perhaps because Joe first wrote these recollections for the paper, and the old Citizens Bank that became Bank of America. Joe was on the board of directors after he moved to town around 1920. He tells us he bought George Rogers' old place on a whim, subdivided and started selling land. He named the tract Temple Hills because hills are the temples of creation. It would be a drab country if we did not have hills, he wrote. Somewhere along the way, he met the local school teacher, took a shine to her and her 2 young daughters, and finally offered to build her a house. Only then, it seems, did they decide to get married. That was in June 1921. Some of Joe's later stories in the book are a little, well, pointless. Just fragments, really. And he still sometimes jumps back 20 or 30 years without warning. But again and again, he keeps coming back to his father. His principal fault, he says, was that he allowed himself to be ruled by his emotions, and those were not very reliable and not properly guided by reason. He was a man, Joe felt, who refused to be satisfied. He had an undying hatred of tyranny in all its forms. He was champion of the downtrodden, whether it might be the tyranny of religion, crooked politics, or a despotic government. He had read Paine's Age of Reason, and as he said, dropped the Bible like he would a hot egg. We were taught that religion was the dying embers of superstition, Joe wrote, that it throttled reason and hindered progress, and that it was vanishing before the light of reason. This sort of talk makes it all the more interesting that Joe never mentions Mormonism. Did he want to leave that impression about Christianity in general? Yet he was clearly a theist, believed in a creator, and perhaps even in the Trinity. I used to wonder how a man of his general ability and with his particular ideals could be so unkind and thoughtless in the treatment of his own children, he wrote. He was very emotional and appeared to let his emotions rule. His word was law, and he was quite sure he could not be mistaken. All this adds a certain air to Joe's later accounts of his dealings with the children of some of his ranch hands, where he portrays himself as rather strict and not afraid, at least in one instance, to strike them. He also portrays himself as smarter than them. He knew what they were up to, and he felt he was better at dealing with them than their own parents. For all this, it makes it rather hollow when Joe writes of his father after 124 pages. When I see men who are called gentlemen, who build up a fortune at the expense of others and the expense of their own character, I realize he was not so bad. Some of his siblings don't fare much better than his father in his book. His portrayal of his oldest brother, George Jr., is none too kindly. And he says he never had anything in common with his brother Frank, only 6 years younger. In fact, he portrays him as a little deranged in later life. His mother, incidentally, is largely a shadowy figure in this story, portrayed as a sad, frugal, and unwilling to stand up for herself or her children. Along the way, we also get a little of Joe's philosophy of life. Thurston, it seems, had a philosophical turn of mind, or at least he thought he did. He even wrote at least one other book about his ideas and ideals. In early days, he writes about how nature works to endure despite its environment and even grows stronger, but does not make the obvious connection to his own situation. He says age does not always bring wisdom, but again, draws no moral. There are some other traits that come through that I find rather unappealing. Joe seems to like to describe his discussions with other people, at least the ones where he comes out on top. And there's a bit of racism in him too. Mendelssohn, the San Juan Capistrano hotel keeper, is always identified as a Jew. Joe also says he disliked going in competition in the vegetable business with the unsavory Chinese. He even observes that rattlesnakes, and there were many of them on their ranch in the early days, at least give a warning before they strike, which is more than I can say for the Japanese or the Germans. He speaks of himself as a lone wolf and a confirmed optimist, and ends his book by stating that a man reveals himself through his actions. It is by his actions that he is classified and remembered. And his siblings, it seems, would all agree. In fact, his younger sister Harriet quickly wrote her rebuttal reminiscences, a 1,322-page manuscript called Children of Aliso. She objects to almost everything that he says in his book, and clearly had access to better documents, family papers. She's much more precise in dates and things like that. Unfortunately, her book has never been published, but the manuscript does still exist. As for Joe's book, frankly, while I find it fascinating to read, I would not recommend it to someone who is looking to learn about early Laguna Beach. Instead, go back to the South Coast News in 1935 and 1936. You will find there a much purer, much less angry set of recollections, and actually a lot of good information there when he was writing for a different audience, I suppose, as he saw it. That's the really interesting story that Joe Thurston left us. His book tells us much more about Joe Thurston than it ever tells us about Laguna Beach. Thank you. Well, do I get out of the room alive? I did hesitate a little bit, but I think some people might just read the book and not really think about what's really going on in there. Any questions about? Yes, sir. Thanks, Joe. She's going to put you on mic, and I'm going to get a drink while she does.
Okay. Do I just ask a question then?
Please.
Okay. I read somewhere or heard that when they arrived at the homestead, that some Mexican fellas were in there, and they had guns, and they almost came to a shootout.
The story that Joe tells is that shortly after they arrived, a group showed up and claimed they had a stake in the place. There was a little shack there, probably an old sheep herder's shack, or maybe something from the Salters when they'd been in there. Joe's belief was that Mr. Rawson sent them down to try and hold that land and prevent anybody settling there on the edge of the Niguel Rancho. But Joe does not, in his book, say anything about guns being drawn on that occasion. So.
The Mexicans were Cisco Kid.
These were, well, if Joe is right, they probably worked on the Niguel Ranch, which was mostly running sheep in those days.
Yeah.
So
The
that
Cisco
would
kid
have, rather
had
than cattle.
Yeah.
So they
Cisco
would've-
Kid had a cave up here that he camped out in.
Any other questions? All afraid to
I
go
have
on
one.
mic. Oh, hello. You're not afraid to go on mic.
I live up in Temple Hills, so I was fascinated with his passage about having purchased with partners the Temple Hills area. And he says, and we named it Temple Hills. So I don't know if he did it or they did it or whatever. But do you know how much he was involved with subdividing it? He said he sat down with somebody and kind of worked on it a little bit. And
What-
we refer to him when we talk about the pathways and all. Do you
What
know
he,
how much
what
he
he
was involved?
says in his book, and I think somewhat typical of Joe, was yes, he ended up with the property up there on the hills. And he says pretty clearly in a couple places he named it Temple Hills. This would be about 1924, 1925. And he claims he went up and kind of walked out where he wanted the roads and everything, where he thought everything should go up there, and then brought in a surveyor who laid out exactly that what he figured out engineering-wise was exactly what Joe had figured out just by walking around. You see, again, it's to me very, I think, sounds typical of Joe Thurston. But that's the story, that he laid it out kind of in his own mind first, and then his engineer did exactly the same thing. But it was, he did want that. He did want to benefit the community, not just with the subdivision, but, trying to set aside some open space. And he, this is a man who did love Laguna Beach.
I have a question too. What were some of the other families that were here, probably not as soon as they came, but that were now we still talk about, or maybe they've had street names for them or something?
Well, a lot of those people are going to come much later than the Thurstons who got here in 1871. There's not even many of the 1880s families when you first start to really get a community. The Brooks do the first subdivision and everything. That a lot of the names you think of are post 1900, and the Thurstons had been here a generation or more by then. The only one I've looked into particularly are the Mormon settlers, not Salt Lake, but reorganized Latter-day Saint settlers up in Laguna Canyon at the old Niguel School in that area, that little community, and they pretty much all moved on to other places. And that's, there's a settlement that was big enough to have its own school district in the 1880s. It's gone. We'll get... Yes, I got her.
Yeah,
Please.
I had heard that there's still some remnants of the homestead back in Aliso Canyon. Do you know if that?
I have not tried to
true?
trespass on the golf course to see if there's...
Because I thought the ranch was going to, maybe do some walks to them. Oh, Mark's here. Hi, Mark.
Yeah, please let us know. I don't go tromping around on other people's property, so...
I'm Mark Christie, and fortunate enough to, still have that property, and I'm very fascinated with the history of Laguna, and I've read this book, cover to cover at least a dozen times. I actually think it's a great history of Laguna, barring the access to the 32 newspapers, which I've seen a few of those. But I really love the stories of North Laguna selling for $11,000, because you couldn't grow crops up there. There wasn't any water, so what's the point? And the Brooks, deciding whether to buy another mile of, the cliffs in South Laguna for, it's an extra 4,800. Another mile, 4,800. Yeah, no. So I thought that stuff was fascinating. And as to your point. We have a really good photo, actually a series of photos, and Ann certainly is well versed in this. We've gone up and literally poked around as near as we can tell, and there was not just the homestead house, there were outbuildings and blacksmith shops, and I would love to tell you we found it, and it's got to be there, right? Because nobody would have taken the time to disassemble this stuff, but maybe with years of rains and dirt and whatever, it's probably buried there somewhere. We've never gone back there, which is something I would love to do with some sort of a metal detector, because, it's got to be there, right? And at some point, you know, when we lick our wounds from, you know, the recent things we've been through, it'd be really cool to, you know, do some sort of a thing. I mean, we've opened up, there were a bunch of dead pine trees. Nobody even knew, you know, that the Thurston homestead was there. Nobody knew about the Girl Scout camp, you know, so it's fascinating to kind of take people back there and say, you know, here it was, you know, first house. I mean, how cool is that? Why didn't they build on the cliff? There was no water. You couldn't grow anything there. And it's really comforting to hear you call it the ranch so many times. I mean, that's what we're calling it again. We were going to call it the Thurston Ranch, but there's Thurston Street and Thurston School, and the confusion would have been a little bit too much. But I mean, in honor of Joe and the family, that's why we went back to that name, because it means more to Laguna than, you know, Aliso Creek Inn or, you know, even Ben Brown's. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, if you want to walk back there and poke around, be my guest. I'll go with you. We'll take some metal detectors. I'd really enjoy that.
Sounds like fun.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, hi. You mentioned Frank Hemingway.
Yes.
Is that Harvey Hemingway? Is that the same person?
I don't have that family worked out, but I know there's, you know, there's at least father and son. I don't know how many generations, but he is another person that Joe didn't seem to think much of.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I don't remember what he said.
Yeah. I'd have to go back and find it. I wonder if Richard Ayotte did an index to Laguna Beach of early days. That was one of his hobbies, was to index books that don't have them. An old librarian said to me once, "It's not a book if it doesn't have an index." Yes, sir.
All right. I was trying to get a little clarification. I think I saw an old picture, and you guys had mentioned it, about Temple Hills, but wasn't there a sign up right behind where we are now that said Temple Hills? How did it then progress to be called Temple Hills over by the Catholic Church now?
Well, I think you'd have to look at how much acreage Joe actually owned up there or subdivided up there. That wouldn't be too hard to find. But yes, it did have its Hollywood Land type sign at one point. I mean, that was how you advertised real estate in the 1920s. And so it's I haven't pulled the track maps to see exactly where the parts he owned were. But as was mentioned, it was up on top of the hill, so there wasn't much else to do up there.
When he
Jane, yeah.
when he named it that, the only way you could get to Temple Hills was at the foot of Thalia Street, at the top of Thalia, and he put in that road that went up to
So
Temple
you'd go
Hills.
from the
that
top
was
of-
all Temple Hills.
So you'd go from the top of Thalia up into the tract.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi. You had mentioned that Thurston had subdivided. Were you talking about Temple Hills? Or?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Temple Hills.
Because my great-great-great-uncle, George Rogers, subdivided downtown Laguna.
Right.
And he had paid Rawson $1,000 to do that, and almost really put him under for putting that kind of money together at that time to have downtown Laguna subdivided into 320 lots. So, and then my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Henry Rogers, first homesteaded Temple Hills down to Bluebird Canyon, and Thurston then had bought
Right.
Temple Hills from
Yes,
him.
Thurston bought that property. And I think some of his property down below here, too, that he got from Rogers.
Right, part of that he did buy from Rogers, George Rogers, Henry Rogers' son. Right.
Okay.
Just to point that out again, somebody had asked earlier if there's any other homesteader families around, and so we did have another one right here in our
Well, yeah,
report, so that's
Laguna
pretty
is in this little notch between the two ranchos, so it was public land and was available once it was surveyed for a homestead. And so that's part of what makes the story of Laguna a little different than a lot of other places in Orange County that start out, their title goes back to a Mexican rancho. Laguna is one of the places, really the only other one where it made any real impact was in Trabuco Canyon, where you really had a fair number of actual homesteaders come in.
I'm going to preface or make a statement before asking a question. Decades ago, when we were very young, Mark Christie and I lived next door to each other on Glenire, just immediately east of Upland Road. And there's a little cabin that sits in the brush above there that was built by a gentleman named Basil Ingalls. It's still there. It used to be turquoise. It's now gray on 14 lots. And his nearest neighbor, he built that cabin in 1911, I think, or thereabouts. His next closest neighbor to build subsequent to him was William Went, which was about a block away. Basil described that when his mother and he came and stayed in the Hotel Laguna when he was very young, they took horses out Glenire, which basically turned into a trail approximately at about Moss Street and went through the brush. His mother bought these 14 lots, and that in those days, they would go down to the Thurston Ranch and buy water by the gallon. And he described it, he died at age 96, about maybe 15 years ago now. He described it as being a nickel for a gallon of water. It's interesting that you told us that the real source of the water was in Wood Canyon because...
Well, not in those days, though. Joe did finally develop some water.
I was going to ask
on the
you
ranch.
if you could tell us more about the water history of the area.
Yeah, no, you're right that he did later develop water on the ranch. I wasn't aware that he sold it, but you know, if you had a ranch, you sold anything you could. And they found a place to basically found a wet spot. I can't think of the right word right now. Huh? Well, just a green spot in the hills that they drilled back in with pipe and kind of created a spring. A seep. He found a seep. My impression from reading it is that it's along the cliffs on the lower side of the canyon behind on the back side of the property somewhere, because he then had gravity flow down to the house. So.
The only other thing I'm thinking is, since we have some relatives of the Thurstons here in the family, I wonder if there's anybody who wants to share any other recollections.
Don't put anybody on the spot on my account.
I'll just stand back here and see if anybody wants to talk.
Well,
does anybody else here add anything or any comments?
well, the earliest, when you look at the newspapers, they tend to talk about the Riverside Camp at Main Beach and Santa Ana Camp at Boat Canyon that were just the tourist, the summer resorts there. And that's usually, I was just saying, you don't find it as Laguna Beach. Obviously, Laguna Canyon had its name. You don't find it as Laguna Beach, at least in the local papers, till the late 1870s. You had a question, sir?
Yeah, I was wondering, this is really unique having this group together here. We can find out everything. My question is this. There are at least 3 streets in Laguna Beach named after Greek muses. And I wanted to know who had that idea. It's very intellectual. It's very historic. It's very wonderful to have 3 streets named after Greek muses. Does anybody know what those streets are?
Cleo.
Very good. Thalia is one.
And Cleo is the muse of history.
Very good. You got 2. Calliope.
Yeah.
Muse of epic poetry. Calliope.
There were other streets besides those that.
Yeah, there was the whole line of streets was named after muses, and I guess they didn't like the complicated names, and they changed, and then Brooks changed them to Brooks and Oak.
You didn't want a Persephone Street and
Meliothene or.
But again, you could go back to the subdivision map and it would show you what the original names were and who did the subdivision, who owned the land. So that's that kind of thing. Some things are harder to trace than others. Street names are actually pretty easy to chase because it's all on the maps of record with the county.
Well, for the fun of it, I'll give you the names of the other muses, and you tell me if you remember those streets. Okay, Polyhymnia. Utopy. Very good. Errato. Very, okay. Errato, where we get the word erotic. Terpsichore. And Urania, who is astronomy. Melpomene, tragedy. Do you remember a street in do you? What would that have been? Is that Brooks or? Melpomene, tragedy. Wow. Tragedy, yeah. I have one more question, and almost every one of you will know this. But when you took a hike up Temple Hills, right after the war, or during the war, World War II, there were Army guys up there with their tents and Army trucks. And how many of you went up and talked to them? Did you? What? 81? I'm talking about 43 and 44. The Army guys were up on our hills in Temple Hills Drive.
Actually, it's not a question. I didn't know if you're all aware of it, but there was a pillbox, and there still is the pillbox behind Irvine Cove, the back up there, where they used to look out for the Japanese planes to approach.
Actually, the pillbox, you mean the one above Abalone Point, right?
Yes.
That was a triangulation station for the guns at Fort MacArthur. So go an equal distance up the coast either way, and those were to aim the big railway guns at Fort MacArthur to shoot at the Japanese ships when they saw them. So, but that was triangulation on the targets.
Yeah, you can still see it there.
Yeah, it's
You
in
can
the
go up
state
there.
park.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Not a question, but a statement. We're from Victoria Cove on Sunset Terrace, and mentioning the military and that era, it was probably about 20 years ago or so. I've always snorkeled and dove down there, but I found what I think is a piece of ordnance that was wedged between the rocks before you go over to where the pool and the turret are located. And would that be possible? It's this crumpled piece of lead, and if I looked on the inside, you could see the threading on one end. So, any ideas? Is there a metallurgist in town that could tell us that?
Yeah, see, the only active bombing range in the county was on the Trabuco Mesa, where Rancho Santa Margarita is today. And when they shifted from there, they went to San Clemente Island, where they were actually throwing bombs. Of course, they were the equivalent of tracer bullets. You know, they weren't fully explosive, but they did have enough explosion that you could see where they landed when you're learning how to drop them where you want to.
Yeah, I see.
So that's the only live fire that went on during the war.
Okay. Also, another comment regarding the water. My dad and his two brothers would go out to the corner of where El Toro Road is and Laguna Canyon, and there was a well there. And they would pump the well water and bring it back to the house on Sunset Terrace.
I've always wondered if that well, you know, that's near the area where the Niguel School was, and it had a well with a pump. And I've never seen that put together, but I've always wondered if that's why there was a well clear up at that far up the canyon.
It resembled an outhouse. There was a kind of a slowly dilapidating structure right in the field on the right-hand side when you go out the Canyon Road to go right on El Toro. It's right next to what is today Annalise's preschool Willowbrook campus. When they did the restoration, habitat restoration, by that time, which was just a few years ago, the outhouse structure was gone, but the concrete platform with the well casing was still there. And I haven't been out there, but I presume that it is. Maybe Ann knows.
Yeah, when we did the restoration, we made sure to stay away from that whole complex of archaeological debris. So there's remains of framing and piping and different kinds of equipment, and it's all still there. And it's being just left alone, as far as I know.
I've walked around out there with pictures of the Nagel School trying to line them up. I do think, if you ever look at those pictures, and there's a number of them, that it was a little further up the canyon than you usually hear. Maybe a little above where El Toro Road comes in. Old. There were, yeah, well, because that area was settled in general up there. Any rate.
Just one thing about the Woods Cove, about the planes, there have been a number of airplanes that landed just off the coast, and the planes were abandoned. You know, the people were the pilots were either rescued and brought ashore, and sometimes the planes were towed back, but usually they were just left out there in the surf. And then there was one episode I read where some bombs fell off of an airplane and they landed on Gaviota Street near Oak Street Beach. It crashed through the house roof. They didn't explode, but they fell off of an airplane. But that's all I know.
Military weaponry around, so. But I don't know where from. I see. Very interesting.
Phil, I was wondering if you know the story. Was Thurston involved with Aliso Beach camp in, I believe, the 20s? I've seen a photograph of a tent camp down in Aliso Beach. I think about the period of the 20s. Eric might know, but
He does not mention that in anything I've read by him. And I'm trying to remember, because, of course, the county gets some of that property pretty early on along in there.
49 was the first purchase.
Was that when the county started in there? But, and of course, by the 20s, though Joe still owned the ranch, he'd moved into town by then.
Hi, I just wanted to say the first, what I recall Laguna being called, the first name was Laguna.
Oh, well, just because the post office couldn't spell, I wouldn't
Well,
put too
that's
much
all right.
into that.
And I wanted
They
to-
butchered a lot of names and still
Right.
do.
And I wanted to tell Mark Christie that I'm one of those Girl Scouts in 1944 that went to camp out there. It was wonderful. I had such a great time out there. We hiked into Aliso Beach. We slept on the beach all night. Just great. Just
Camp-
Bunsen burners and backpacks.
Camp Dolph or Dolphin or?
No, we walked out on the road from the campground way back there.
It was just Dolph, yeah.
Yeah. And another thing I can remember in school, when I was in school, we heard those guns all the time. I mean, it was boom, 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 boom. They were doing gun practice out in San Clemente. And that went on for years. And I can also remember in the early part of, well, in fact, it was after the war, there was a station up on top of Temple Hills that there were a lot, they would watch all night for planes flying over. That was one of our...
A spotter post.
A spotter
an
post,
aircraft
and a lot
spotter,
of the
sure.
fellas in my class would go up there and stay overnight and watch for
Yeah,
planes.
those were generally strictly
That was-
volunteer operations,
Right,
those
exactly.
spotters. And that's still
Yeah.
the expression we still use, oh, don't worry, it's one of ours.
Yeah.
Right? That goes back to the spotters with their silhouette cards of the different planes.
When I was a child, my name is Richard Duke, excuse me. When I was a child, Mr. Heisler used to shoot at us with rock salt. Yeah. And some of the guys would get hit by it, tell me it stung pretty bad. But I remember the otters running up and down the creek, too, when I was a kid. Seeing otters running up and down, they had little trout in the stream. I remember that when I was a kid.
There were some residual Thurston parcels in the trust, the Thurston Trust. One of the last of which that I'm familiar with is the last remaining remnant of the old Coast Road in Laguna, which is the 30-foot wide right-of-way that wraps behind the phone company building at Inland Aliso Beach Park and winds up to the horseshoe where Brooks and Monterey meet in the Coast Royale tract. And the county purchased that right-of-way around 1960 or 61 as part of Aliso Beach County Park. And it's still there. It's a dirt road. Because as most of the people in this room know, that in the old days, there were no bridges spanning the creeks as close to the ocean as they are. You had to go way inland and then come back out. So to go up Aliso Canyon, you would go up what is now Country Club Drive, just like you were going to the ranch or the golf course. You would cross way back closer to where Violet Brown's office used to be. There's used to be footings for that old bridge there. And then you would wrap on the south side of the creek up into the Coast Royale tract. But anyway, there were some interesting remnant parcels in the Thurston Trust, and that's an example of one.
One of the things that Thurston did, according to the newspaper articles that I wrote, was he objected to how the state was planning to take Coast Highway across Aliso Creek, and I think he sued the state to prevent them from excavating what he called the beautiful bluffs. And you can see the remains of those bluffs. He lost his case, and they did. That's why they sliced all along in front of Coast Royal, and they sliced by Aliso Circle, and I think that's how he got the bridge, because he owned the land of Aliso Circle, and he owned the land on the other side, and was able to get the bridge out of it. But he wanted them to design a whole different, a high bridge over Aliso Canyon so that they wouldn't be cutting the bluffs.
Yeah, if I remember right, it got into the right-of-way and eminent domain and all of that, with him resisting them crossing at least some of the property.
Well, thank everybody so much. And a quick recruitment before we break. We're always on the lookout for informed, and energetic board members. If anybody's interested in our 2016 board, please come talk to me after the talk. This is our last program of 2015, of course. So I hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving, holiday season. Of course, we'll see you here for our programs beginning in 2016. Thanks, everybody, for coming.